David Brewster here with a new episode of Scales and Tales, and this is the Chord Scale Matchmaker. And I know that title makes this episode sound like it's going to be some weird music theory dating game, but that's not the kind of matchmaking I'm talking about. This episode is going to focus on the relationship between chords and scales. And just as a reminder, all chords come directly from scales. That includes, basic major and minor triads, all the way up to crazy extensions and dissonant sounds within chords. So every chord you've ever heard or played, came directly from a scale. And then arpeggios are basically the notes of a chord played separately. So that's related to this as well. So all three areas of that, scales, chords, and arpeggios, are related and kind of linked together. To get started here, we need to pick a key and also select a tonality. So I'm going to pick the key of E and select E minor, basically. So this entire episode is going to revolve around the key of E minor. And that means it's going to be up to you to shift this over into a major key and to other tonalities and stuff too. But to get started, we're going to basically play E natural minor or E Aeolian right here. Very common scale. We've mentioned and looked at Aeolian a lot on this channel, but here's a chart featuring the breakdown of E Aeolian or E natural minor. So from that scale, if we target the root, the third, and the fifth, that'll produce a minor triad. So in the key of E minor, that's E, G, and B. And there's your minor triad, or arpeggio, right there. Right? And that was just E, G, B, E, G, B, E, like that. And you can find that arpeggio everywhere. You can also find the chord everywhere too. E minor lives way down there, very common right here. But let's play it right here. Right? So there's E minor, there's E, E, G, G, B, E. So it's the three notes we need for the triad, but there's additional, duplicates of those notes in that chord right there. So we're really just fretting two notes, that E and G, and everything else is an open string. So there's E minor right there. And the notes of that chord produce, the E minor arpeggio. There's E, G, B, E, G, B, E. And then as far as, looking at the scale, basically the chord has the root, the flat third, and the fifth. So within this E natural minor scale, those three notes are really going to stand out and pop. That chord behind me, and you can hear how those three notes kind of jump out. There's the minor third. There's the root. There's the fifth right there. So I'm targeting those three notes, but also kind of making it melodic and musical. Also, you might notice I was adding other notes from the scale, not just those chord tones, but I was targeting those chord tones, either, with some vibrato or setting up the phrases, to really kind of, emphasize whatever chord tone I wanted to target. Something important to remember right there. Emphasize. So there was E natural minor scale, and we found the chord. We also kind of looked at the arpeggio there too. And now we're going to basically move to the next chord type we're going to hit here, and that's going to be E minor 7. So moving away from E minor, all we have to do to change this to E minor 7 is just add the 7th. So just a review, the 7th note of that scale is D. So we need to add a D to this E minor scale, and we can actually do that right there. Just fret the 7th fret on the G string, which is the note D, and voila, keep everything else the same, and that's E minor 7 right there. What good is that 7th? The 7th is very, very important. Definitely when you land on that note, it really wants to pull you back to the root. That D to E, very, very common. You can also move down to the 5th, that B. You might hear like a chromatic passing tone or a slide, down to that 5th. But you know, once we introduce that note to the chord, then suddenly that seventh really stands out, right? So here's that chord with the TC electronic ditto looper. So here's E minor 7, and I'm going to play around with the scale, but I'm going to target a lot of Ds. So check this out. Hear people bending that note, you know, in blues and stuff like that. But that's a very expressive note to kind of play around with, and then you start targeting that seventh, you know, with other notes from the scale. And as far as finding an E minor 7 arpeggio, all we have to do is add the note D to an E minor arpeggio, and voila, we're there, like this. Right? And there I played this arpeggio, you know, E minor, but I added D. I kind of moved into this arpeggio right there and added D right there and right here, right? But that's really important to realize, you know, what changed when you added that one note to that chord, which was D, that changed E minor to E minor 7. So what about the notes we haven't used so far? So far we've used the root, the minor third or flat third, the fifth, and the flat seventh. So there are notes from the E minor scale that we haven't used yet. We haven't looked at the second, we haven't used the fourth, and we haven't used the flat 6. So here's an animation, kind of a budget animation, but it's showing, you know, the E natural minor scale, notes are highlighted, and then it's showing, you know, the notes that we haven't used yet. And we're going to start adding these to the chords and arpeggios that we're looking at. So here's this animation, very low budget, no budget actually, but just notice that shift when it changes. So the first note that we haven't used yet that we're going to add to the mix is the 6th. Technically it's the flat 6th, the note C. So in the key of E minor, right here, you just count the notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's your 6th, C, right there. And all we need to do now is just add a C to this E minor chord we've been playing with. So you could think of this, you know, either based off E minor or the E minor 7, either way. So all we're going to do is we're going to add the C note right there on the 5th fret on the G string. So if you relate that to, you know, E minor 7, we're just moving back there. Or if you relate that to E minor, we're adding that, you know, C note right there. Either way. But there's an E minor flat 6. You know, pretty happening chord. I'm going to loop that with a TC electronic ditto looper. And then just notice how that flat 6 seems to pop or jump against the chord, like this. You know, really expressive sound too, just targeting that note. You know, against that flavor and tonality. You know, it sounds really good, and you can hear how this all matches. It's almost like pieces of a puzzle coming together. So before we move away from the flat 6, I did want to demonstrate briefly what happens when you just play a regular 6th. You know, instead of playing C natural, what if we change that to C sharp right there, a regular 6th? So now we don't have, you know, the flat 6, it's a regular 6th, and that's going to imply Dorian technically. So now instead of natural minor, we have more of a Dorian kind of tonality right here. Right, with that C sharp like this. Really seems to jump out right there because it's in the chord, and then when you hit it, you know, as part of a lick or part of a melodic phrase, it really pops. Now we're going to include and target the 9th, which in the key of E minor is the note F sharp. So right here, you know, the second note of the scale is F sharp right there. So if we add that that note to the chord, E minor add 9, it's very common. And we found that in lots of different episodes on this channel right here. Down here, think of like Pink Floyd and Metallica, and you can definitely find a lot of songs with that, particular voicing right there. But we're going to play around in this area. We're going to keep the chords, in this general neighborhood, because we had E minor 7, E minor flat 6, and then we also just played around with E minor 6. But now we're going to be looking for that ninth, that F sharp. So think of E minor and then add this F sharp right there on the 7th fret on the B string, and you have E minor add 9 like this. Real dreamy and spacey chord. I love it. That with TC Electronic did a looper, and now I'm going to target these ninths, that F sharp. As soon as that note appears in a chord, then it's like it lights up, and then suddenly that's a really usable note over the chord. Right now we're going to start targeting the 4th, which is also known as the 11th, and that's the note A. So in E natural minor right here, it's the 4th note, A, right there. So now we're going to be adding an A to this E minor, chord. So unfortunately, because we're in this position right here, it's kind of tricky to get a good, version of this chord. So what I actually did is I'm doing it like this. And I'm doubling the A, because we're fretting the A right there on the 7th fret on the D string, and also the 5th fret on the high E. And then everything else is related to E minor. As an E minor 11, and then once we add that note to the chord and we start targeting those A notes from the scale, that note just pops like this. Last area here, we're actually going to start talking about non-diatonic chords, or oddball chords that pop up, in songs. And I've had lots of students ask me about this. Like, they'll come in for a lesson, play some deranged, crazy chord that they found, and then they'll ask, like, hey, what scale fits over this? So if you've ever been stumped by this area of the lesson's for you. So let's move away from the diatonic sounds that we've uncovered so far, because everything that we've uncovered except for the E minor 6, but everything else was related directly to E natural minor or Aeolian. The E minor chord, E minor 7, the E minor flat 6, the E minor add 9, and the E minor 11 too. All of those are diatonic to E minor, because all those notes we were adding and kind of changing around came directly from E Aeolian or E natural minor. The only exception there so far was that E minor 6, with that C sharp, and that was pulling you toward Dorian instead of natural minor. Let's move away from that. Let's do something completely different. So let's investigate playing over this chord. Okay, very much an oddball chord right there. So that is an E minor 11 flat 5 right there, because you've got E, G, B flat, D, there's A, which is your 11, and then the high E too. Here's a breakdown of that chord. And as far as finding the scale that perfectly matches the tonality or sound of that chord, the chord we're going to gravitate toward, it's actually known as an Aeolian flat 5. It's also known as Locrian natural second, Or the half diminished scale is another name for it, and that's right here. So E half diminished looks like this. E, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C, D, and E. And here's a breakdown or an image kind of showing you that scale. The Aeolian flat 5, which is basically the 6th mode from melodic minor. We targeted a specific chord, this E minor 11 flat 5, a very unusual tonality there, and then we found the appropriate scale that matches the tonality of the chord, which is this Aeolian flat 5 or the half diminished scale. And just playing the scale just straight up and down over the chord kind of reveals that exotic flavor and sound. I mean, this is really all you have to do. Different flavor because of that flat 5. Alright, that's going to wrap this episode of Scales and Tales with the Chord and Scale Matchmaker. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more where this came from. We really just locked into E minor and kind of fleshed out some ideas that were diatonic and then started to kind of move more in a non-diatonic direction. But then, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, you can shift it to major. You can start investigating all your 7th chords, major 7, dominant 7, minor 7, and really start attacking this head on. And we also didn't look at the flat 2, which is also known as the flat 9. We also didn't investigate the raised 4th or sharp 11 in this episode. So there's more to this. Obviously, this is not a complete, episode or lesson. It's really just kind of starting the conversation and kind of getting you thinking about some of this stuff. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.